Welcome to Pleasurology Island. I'm Free Thought Steve. Thanks for stopping by. Welcome to another meeting of the pioneers of pleasurology. Those of us who are trying to create the science of feeling good as we live our lives, learning how to make the best use possible of this system of pleasure generation that we have been given and that we inhabit, our consciousness and our body, learning how to have fun with our body, learning how to have fun with our consciousness, learning how to make our fun even more pleasurable by using cannabis in connection with body-mind relaxation for Cannabis Bodymind Pleasurology, where we can gradually loosen up and dissolve, we can gradually loosen up and dissolve the character armor, the mask of personality, rigidity that we have learned as we've grown up and that has been built into our emotional brain, so that our emotional brain now has habits of facing the world with anxiety, with irritation, with impatience, with frustration, with attachment to getting what we want, with being in control, because being in control is one of the ways to master anxiety. What we want to feel is safe and nurtured the way that we were, hopefully, when we were a child, being held by someone who loved us and feeling that comfort and safety of being protected by someone larger than ourselves, who loves us and is devoted to taking care of us and is going to make sure nothing bad happens to us. And if that sounds familiar, that's because what religion is a form of imaginarily putting us back in that situation of being nurtured by a loving and all-powerful parent figure. And that gives us a very nice feeling when we choose to believe that. If we choose to believe that the universe is benevolent and that somehow the creator of the universe that contains 400 billion galaxies, not 400 billion stars, but 400 billion galaxies, each galaxy having billions of stars, and that extends out, 13.5 billion light years in all directions, and every light year is, 6 trillion miles. So it's just conceivable that the universe isn't even aware of our existence, and that if we're living our lives to try and please the universe so that the universe will be loving back to us, then we may be just sort of wasting our time, except that if we believe that the universe loves us, that makes our emotional brain feel good, makes us feel safe, and people love that feeling of safety. It's just as much as they love getting high on opioids, which activate the very same circuits in their brain, the nurturing circuits, the circuits that make us feel loved and nurtured when we're children. So people can give themselves an imaginary opioid by visualizing themselves as being especially protected and cared and loved for by imaginary beings who may or may not be there at all, and we have no reason to believe that they are there, except that we want them to be there. And for those of us who prefer to be realists and look at the world as realistically as possible, then we have to find other ways of feeling safe. And the best way of feeling safe and nurtured is to create a tender nest of a few other people whom you really trust and love, and get together for sandwich hugs, and you know that you would help each other out in any situation where you need help. You could go to these folks, they'd be your friends, and to help take care of you, so that we could have a realistic feeling of being safe. It would actually be nice to have a world that it was realistic to feel totally safe in. And what we should do is not exaggerate the danger of the situation that we're in. We're probably living in a safer situation than human beings have ever lived in before, and yet there are lots of dangers still out there. So it's important for us to feel that the environment that we live in, our immediate environment, is as safe as possible so we can feel relaxed in our immediate environment, and that feeling safe and calm, peaceful and relaxed, is not unrealistic, but it is realistic to say, yes, where I'm at right now, I think everything's going to be fine. No one's going to hurt me here. I'm safe where I am, and there's no need for me to be anxious in advance, worrying about something that will probably never happen to me, like, having a nuclear bomb dropped on me. Now, if a nuclear bomb was dropped right on me, that would be absolutely great, because I would immediately dissolve, and my consciousness would dissolve instantly, at which point all my troubles would be over, because death is the complete absence of all stress and all problems. And it's what's waiting for all of us at the end of the road. And it's total freedom from the stress and strain of being alive. And it's impossible to even notice that you're dead when you're dead. I think it's very important for us to think about death as pleasurologists. As pleasurologists, it's really important for us to have an accurate, precise picture of death, because death is nothing that we should be afraid of. And yet people are afraid of death. All their lives they're more afraid of death than anything else. I am not afraid of death. I'm afraid of suffering while I'm alive. I will do anything I can to avoid suffering while I'm alive, including dying if necessary, if that's the best solution, because death is the dissolving of consciousness. I am my consciousness. I am the field of consciousness that my brain is generating at every instant, just like a TV picture is being generated at every instant. A camera, a computer monitor is regenerating the picture that's in front of us every instant. Well, our whole consciousness is constantly being regenerated by our brain. And if our brain loses oxygen for even a few seconds, and it will run out of oxygen, and the neurons will quit functioning, and we will lose consciousness at that time. Our field of consciousness, the field of consciousness that our brain is generating, simply won't be generated anymore. It will evaporate. It'll immediately dissolve, which is not a painful experience at all, to have our consciousness dissolve as such. That's very pleasant, actually. I've experienced my consciousness dissolving on many occasions, and it's always been extremely pleasurable. It's really a delight to let go of the aches and pains of the body and to just float off into nothingness, and to have consciousness close down and just vanish completely. I once had an unusual opportunity of losing consciousness while remaining conscious the entire time. We all lose consciousness every night when we go through our sleep cycles. At the beginning of every sleep cycle is a period of what they call dreamless sleep, non-dreaming sleep, where consciousness is not present at all, because the consciousness circuits in our brain have shut down completely. They're taking a break, they want to rest. And so for that period of time, we are not present. Our consciousness dissolves, and we're not there at all. And then after a while, we start dreaming, and our consciousness comes back, and we are conscious of our dreams, and then eventually we wake up, and we're in waking consciousness. But for that short period of time, it can be anywhere from half an hour to 40 minutes, something like that, sometimes 20 minutes, of dreamless sleep at the beginning of each dream cycle. For that short period of time, we are effectively dead. We are in the condition of non-existence, which is what waits for all of us when our brain shuts down. At that point, our brain quits producing the field of consciousness that is us. And so we are no longer there. We don't notice that we're not there. We don't notice when we go through dreamless sleep every night, because it's impossible to notice the absence of consciousness. It requires being conscious to notice anything. It requires being conscious to have an awareness of anything, including the passage of time. So when you take consciousness away, you take everything away. You take time away. You take all memories of ever having existed. You take all sense of where we are. We don't have a sense of being anymore. And so we've all been through death thousands of times in our life. We die 1,000 times a year in our sleep. If there's 365 days a year, and each night we go through 3 or 4 dream cycles, every one of those sleeping and then dreaming cycles begins with a period of being dead, of being non-existent. All that being dead means is that our field of consciousness, the one that we're enjoying right now, simply isn't there. And when that happens, time disappears. Time vanishes with consciousness, because we cannot feel the passage of time unless we're conscious to be aware that things are flowing on and that this moment is different from the moment that came before it, and so forth. It requires consciousness to be aware that time is passing. So without consciousness, in dreamless sleep, no time is felt by us at all. We don't notice that we're not there. We don't regret not being there. We're not bored. We'd have to be conscious to be bored. I used to visualize death as an endless stretch of dark boredom. That was after I had quit believing in Christianity. I said, well, okay, if I'm not going to heaven or hell, then when I die, there's going to be nothing. And what's nothing? Nothing is blackness that goes on forever and ever and ever. And that's certainly preferable to hell. But on the other hand, it sounds boring. And so I was sort of depressed. I was a depressed, non-religious person. When you give up the religious belief in the afterlife, it's easy to become depressed because you visualize, when I'm going to die, I'm going to be dead a long time. We're only alive a short time, and then we're dead a really long time. We're dead forever. And that just goes on and on and on, this black darkness. Well, that was how I visualized it until the first time that I lost consciousness and was aware of it happening. And could watch my brain shut down little by little. And as it did so, my consciousness, different parts of my consciousness kind of disappeared. Different areas of awareness disappeared, and then it finally narrowed down to a little tiny, tiny spot of awareness, and then that disappeared. And then I felt a tap on the back of my head, and I heard somebody say, oh man, I think Steve passed out. And I had indeed passed out. And I had watched my brain shutting down due to the lack of oxygen. And the reason that I didn't breathe in and bring oxygen back to my brain was that I was so heavily sedated on a combination of cannabis, probably nitrous oxide, and pure tobacco, snuff burning. My friend had put out we'd all been getting high on his electric pipe, which is a very easy way to get really high. It just shoots a cool stream of smoke into your lungs. And Kenny always had really good weed. And so I had been practicing pranayama. Pranayama is yoga breathing. And you'll want to learn how to do this. You relax your stomach here, you relax the middle of your waist, and then you let this muscle called the diaphragm move downward. As you breathe in, the diaphragm moves downward, and it pulls your lungs down with it, kind of. It opens up a space there, and air can flow into your lungs as the diaphragm moves downward and your stomach goes forward. And then, when you've expanded downward, then you breathe into the center of your lungs and breathe sort of outward like that, and your rib cage, lower part of your rib cage fills up. And then when that's full, then you lift your shoulders a little bit and you breathe up into the front of your chest up here real high. And you can take in just a little bit more air. And then you close your throat and your nasal passage and hold your breath. And practice doing this for 10 seconds or something like that. And I'd been doing a lot of that, practicing holding my breath, and then letting it out, and then breathing in for 3 counts, another 3 counts here, another 3 counts there, and then holding for 10 counts, and then letting it out gently. So I'd been practicing this pranayama, and I knew that it was a good way to get as high as you could off of a single hit on the electric pipe full of cannabis. If you take the air in, you don't want to just breathe it in and breathe it out. You want to hold it and keep it in your lungs as long as possible. That allows as much of the THC from the smoke to get into your lungs and up to your brain, then through the bloodstream up to your brain as possible. So you can make the most out of each hit by holding it as long as possible. And so when I was smoking cannabis for many years, that's what I did. But eventually that coats your lungs with tar, and it's really bad for you. So I quit that. I had a bad smoker's cough. I quit smoking and didn't use cannabis for 10 years until I was able to get cannabis legally with edibles. And I've been taking edibles ever since, and that's really nice. That's the way to go without damaging my lungs. But in any case, at this time, this was way back when I was 24 years old, back in the spring of 1973. And so I had taken a few big hits and absorbed really a lot of THC from this really excellent weed that Kenny had. And then he opened up a bullet, a .22 caliber bullet, and poured out the gunpowder on a wooden railing. Now, this was on a porch outdoors at a cabin out in the country, and he poured this gunpowder down on this wooden railing. And then on top of the gunpowder, he opened up a can of snuff and took out a curl of snuff, which is like pure tobacco leaf, and he put that on top of the gunpowder. And I think he learned this from his uncles. I mean, he had a family tradition of getting high, and his uncles had somehow come up with this combination. And later, where I found out why it works, when Kenny lit the gunpowder, it went whoosh like that, and it flashed like that, and then it caught the snuff on fire. So there were gunpowder fumes mixed with tobacco, very, very highly concentrated tobacco fumes, curling up from this. And Kenny said, lean over and take a nose hit out of this. So I leaned over, and well, we all did this in turn. There was a half a dozen of us. And when it came to be my turn, I leaned over and took a huge lungful of air, which was a mixture of gunpowder fumes and tobacco snuff smoke. Now, the gunpowder fumes contained gunpowder contains nitrates. And so that's nitrogen and some other stuff. So when the gunpowder flashed, those fumes must have contained nitrous oxide or laughing gas. So I was inhaling a combination of laughing gas and tobacco, nicotine, and I'd already gotten high on cannabis. And my emotional brain was really put to sleep almost by all of this. Cannabis relaxes our emotional brain to begin with, and then tobacco is a very strong relaxant. My wife, who's from Belgium, her grandfather used to catch like moths or something in a jar of glass, and he smoked a pipe, and he would take in a lungful of tobacco smoke and open the jar and breathe the tobacco smoke into the jar and close it up again, and do that a few times until the moths then would actually go to sleep and die from the nicotine that put their systems to sleep. So I had the cannabis plus the nicotine, and then nitrous oxide, laughing gas, the only time I've ever had it, which is, wow, just quite an experience. What happened was I took in this big lungful of air and through my nose, and I did a big yoga breath. I breathed down into my stomach, then into the center of my chest, and then into my upper chest. And when I'd filled my lungs, I stood up and moved away so the next person could get in there, and just stood there holding my breath as long as I could to get as much benefit out of this as possible. And I closed my eyes and stood there because all of a sudden I started to feel really, really good. I was just standing there and I felt like I was getting lighter and lighter. And everything was just like sparklingly pleasant, euphoric, wonderful feeling euphorically. And then gradually, as I held my breath, my heart was pumping air from my lungs into my brain. My brain was using the oxygen and then breathing and then releasing carbon dioxide into the blood to go back into the lungs. And it was just recirculating like that while I held my breath. I stood there and held my breath for a long time. And gradually I felt lighter and lighter. I think the first thing that happened was I was looking out toward a bright sunny area from this porch, a shaded porch. So looking through my eyelids, I could see kind of a glow out there. And gradually that glow sort of got darker around the edges and moved in toward the center until just the center part was glowing, as though it were the far end of a tunnel out there with a light out there, which is, of course, is what people report during near-death experiences. But what was happening was that the part of the brain that uses the most oxygen all the time is the visual field, which happens to be located at the back of the brain, but it's producing that visual field that we see in front of us. And in order to keep producing it, to keep generating that visual field every second, in fact, many times per second, those nerve cells in the visual part of the brain use a huge amount of oxygen. So when the brain starts running out of oxygen, when it gets low on oxygen, the first thing that happens is that the edges of the visual field start to go dark and come in toward the center. Now, the brain is preserving as much oxygen flow to the center of our visual field as possible, because that's what we have to be aware of if we're going to survive in a situation. We need to be able to see what's going on in the center of our field of vision as long as possible. The periphery doesn't matter so much, but the center of vision needs to have a good blood flow and oxygen flow so that it continues to see what's going on. in case, if we're in an emergency, we've got to try and find our way out of someplace. So that was the light at the end of the tunnel experience, as my visual field went down like that, but I could still see, at the same time, my emotional state was very euphoric. It was totally happy, So the nitrous oxide laughing gas and the cannabis and the tobacco fumes were making me feel really wonderful. Now, ordinarily, when we start to run out of oxygen, there's an area in the brainstem. Here's the brain, and if you look at the middle of the brain, there's the emotional brain, all the red area, and down here in the brainstem, there's a special center that is devoted to measuring how much carbon dioxide and oxygen are in our bloodstream. And when the carbon dioxide gets too high and the oxygen gets too low, this part of our brain signals to our emotional brain and gives us a feeling of panic that we've got to breathe, and we have to breathe in. And so then the emotional brain sends nerve impulses down the spine to the lungs and chest, and we breathe in whether we like it or not. There's no way we can hold our breath at a certain point, because that brainstem area makes the emotional brain have a feeling of panic and feel like I've got to breathe. But my emotional brain was so sedated by the combination of cannabis, nitrous oxide, and tobacco that my emotional brain didn't get that message from the brainstem. It wasn't even receiving that. I didn't feel any panic whatsoever. And that's why this was such an unusual situation, that I could actually watch my brain shutting down and actually stopping producing consciousness completely. I could observe that process only because my emotional brain was so darn relaxed, so completely relaxed and kicking back and saying, hey, I feel great. So I stood there, and the deal was, I didn't even remember at this point that I was holding my breath. What I was experiencing was so cool. I was just sort of floating, and consciousness was sort of floating up toward the sky, that I had totally forgotten I was holding my breath. So I continued to hold my breath just out of habit, because I've been practicing pranayama for quite some time now. And as I stood there feeling wonderful, I'm just going to go with this experience because it just feels wonderful. I'm going to see where it's taken me. And gradually my body sensations kind of changed. First thing that happened was that I felt a lot of aches and pains throughout my whole body. I'd been doing a lot of yoga. I'd been stretching my muscles, and the muscles were sore, but I hadn't been able to really feel that soreness. And then for a moment, I could feel all kinds of soreness in my muscles that I hadn't felt before. There was some kind of set of nerves in my brain that had been blocking those pain sensations, those bodily pain sensations, out of consciousness because they weren't very strong. They were mild, dull muscle aches. But nevertheless, part of my brain had been preventing those pain signals from getting through to consciousness. And that part of the brain ran out of oxygen. So the filter that had been keeping the pain away dissolved when those neurons quit working, and the pain sensations were able to come up into consciousness. And so as I was standing there, all of a sudden, my whole body, I could feel aches in my body, in my muscles that I hadn't felt before. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. I didn't realize my body was so sore. But then what happened was the neurons that were responsible for receiving those pain signals, they ran out of oxygen too. And so the pain signals dissolved. They went away. They just disappeared from consciousness. And it felt like my body had just dissolved completely. And I was just sort of a floating sphere, a floating globe of consciousness, still feeling really good emotionally, still feeling pure euphoria. And I quit hearing the sounds around me. And I started hearing a noise that sounded like a choir singing, like angels singing, okay? Another feature of the near-death experience, right, that people will report is hearing choirs, of angels. Well, it was just that when my auditory system starts running out of oxygen, the neurons in my auditory system, in my hearing system in my brain, started generating these wonderful high-pitched sounds like choir angels singing, And I could tell that it was being generated by my own brain. I wasn't worried about it. I didn't think it really was angels at all. I just thought, yeah, my brain's making this beautiful music. That's very cool. And I felt like I was weightless and I was kind of floating. I was pure consciousness and pure euphoria. And I would have liked to have stayed right there, for a long, long time. I suppose eventually it would have gotten boring, if I had stayed just a pure, weightless ball of consciousness there, hearing these beautiful choir sounds and not seeing anything. By that time, I think even the light at the tunnel had closed down and disappeared. And so I wasn't seeing anything. I was hearing choir voices, and I wasn't feeling any aches and pains from my body. I felt completely weightless. I was like floating in space. And then, so I would have liked to have stayed there in that state. Eventually it probably would have gotten boring after a year or two. But boy, at first it was just really, it was so great. I just wanted to be there forever. But then, as my brain continued to run out of oxygen, and as I continued to hold my breath without even knowing that I was holding my breath, consciousness sort of became smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, and my awareness became smaller and smaller and smaller until there was just like a little tiny pinpoint of awareness left. And then, poof, that disappeared. And for a second or two, I'm sure, I had no consciousness whatsoever, but I don't know how long it lasted, because as soon as that little poof of consciousness went away, there was no more consciousness for me to be aware of time passing at all, or to be aware of the fact that I wasn't conscious. I wasn't there anymore. Steve had narrowed down to a tiny pinprick, and then just poof, Steve just wasn't there. But then the back of Steve's head felt a little tap on it. And I heard somebody say, "Whoa, I think he passed out." And sure enough, I was lying on the floor. As soon as I passed out and I lost consciousness completely and fell down to the floor, my body naturally started breathing again. I couldn't hold my breath now that I was no longer conscious. The breath-holding impulse had gone away. And so my body was breathing naturally as I was lying on the floor, because that little area in my brainstem, knew that I needed oxygen. So as soon as I lost consciousness, I started breathing naturally again. And I gradually became aware of the fact that I was lying on the floor, on my back, and I'd fallen down. I hadn't hurt myself at all. And one guy got on one arm, and another guy got on the other arm and sort of lifted me up, And, Kenny asked if I was all right. He was quite concerned. And I suddenly realized that I had just had the experience of dying. I had just found out what dying was like, and it was wonderful. It was fabulous. I had no regrets, and it wasn't painful at all. It was absolutely delicious to lose consciousness completely. It was great, and I was back though I was alive again. So I'd been resurrected from the dead. And the enormity of this realization that death was nothing to be afraid of was so emotionally exciting to me, such an incredible insight to me. It filled me with a burst of emotional energy to be alive again, to have died and come back again, and realize that death was so cool. Death is delightful. Death is bliss. Death is twice as nice as this, was the way I felt. It filled me with such a burst of emotional energy all of a sudden that I couldn't just stand there on the porch. There were about 3 steps down off of the porch to the ground, to the yard outside. I lived next door in a cabin on the other side of a fence there, but there was a gateway in the fence. There was an opening in the fence that you would go through to get to the other cabin. And I don't know, I was on the porch there, and I just was filled with so much energy that I just leaped off the porch in one bound, didn't bother going down the stairs, just leaped down and hit the ground running as I had all this energy. And I just ran straight through the gap in that fence over toward my cabin. I just had to move. And I ran right straight to that gap, and I totally forgot that there was a chain that was hung across there to make sort of a little artificial gate, and you would unhook the chain when you wanted to go through, and you'd hook it back up after you'd gone through. It was just symbolic. But anyway, that chain was there. It was a thick-linked chain, and I ran right into it. It hit me right in the midriff and bent me over double like that. I almost fell over, but I didn't. It sort of then flung me back. I hit it with so much force, it flung me right back. I staggered back, and I got my feet. I looked at that gate, I looked at that chain, and I took 2 steps and leaped over the chain. And I mean, I'm not a hurdler or anything, but I just leaped over that chain, hit the ground running on the other side, ran all the way around my cabin, out the driveway on the other side to the road, down the road to the right, through the oak grove there, up the road that went up the hill to the top of the hill where there was a water tower. And by the time I got to the top of the hill, I had worked off that energy, and I was able to just sit there on a rock, on a boulder, looking out over the valley below and across the way toward the river and the hills beyond, and just say, wow, that was something. Kenny came up looking for me after a while. He was worried about me. He didn't know what, I assured him that it was great, it was wonderful, but I just had to let off all that energy. So that was my first experience of losing consciousness, and actually my only, I have also watched my brain do the same thing, but not so slowly. You see, in this case, I was standing there, my heart was pumping, I was holding my breath, and so my heart was pumping the air in my lungs through my brain, and it was circulating, and I was running out of oxygen quite slowly. My brain was using up the oxygen, and it wasn't getting replaced. So the various parts of my brain were slowly losing oxygen, but it took quite a while, and that gave me time to really observe the whole process as it happened. Other times that I have experienced this have been like, if you remember, there was a sauna in the basement of my aunt and uncle's house where I lived when I was getting my teaching credential. And that was where I first started masturbating. That was where I first learned to do like super euphoric sex and prolong my high arousal and then finally have a cosmic orgasm. And the sauna was a really good place to do that because when you get hot, your muscles relax. And a sauna is very relaxing. Well, so on other occasions when I was using the sauna just to relax, I was like lying down in the sauna. Nobody else was there. I was putting water on the electric rocks that heated the sauna, so there would be steam in the sauna. And every so often it would get so hot, I would need to get up and go out of the sauna, a few steps along the hallway, and into the bathroom, and then go into the shower, the cold shower in the bathroom, and cool off. So occasionally what would happen would be I'd be lying there totally relaxed in the sauna, and my heart would get very relaxed. And I have low blood pressure anyway. I've always had low blood pressure. And so sometimes I would decide, oh, it's just too hot in here. I got to go get a shower. So I'd stand up quickly, open the door, walk down the hall and into the bathroom to get into the shower. But I had gotten vertical. I'd been horizontal. And so there wasn't that much blood flow going on. I got vertical, and all of a sudden gravity was pulling the blood down. My heart was still totally relaxed, so it wasn't pumping much blood up to my brain. So my brain, as I walked along, I did some vigorous movement walking along to the shower, and my brain and my blood pressure, or my heart and my blood pressure, couldn't keep up with the oxygen demand from my brain. When I stood up and was vertical and gravity was drawing everything down, all the blood down that way, and I got to the bathroom to get into the shower, and I blacked out. My vision closed down just like it did before, and I lost my balance, I lost consciousness, and once again I woke up on the floor. But that happened really fast. But it was a pleasant feeling. As I lost consciousness, it was very pleasant to let go of the aches and pains in my body and everything else, and to just have my mind completely washed clean of all thoughts and everything. It was really pleasant. And then I found myself on the floor, and I said, wow, well, it was really a nice experience, but I don't think I should repeat it very often because I'm liable to hurt myself, hit my head against the sink as I fall or something like that. So, after that, I learned how to, when I would get up and I'd feel myself blacking out, I would bend forward and do a lot of deep breathing, hold on to something maybe, but immediately breathe very deeply and very hard, even sit down if necessary. If there was some place to sit down, I would, like the end of a bed or somewhere that I could sit easily. But in any case, make sure that I didn't actually totally lose consciousness. However, what I can say is that going right to the edge of losing consciousness is an extremely pleasurable feeling, as long as you're not in a panic state about it. As long as you're just relaxed and going with it and breathing enough so that you're not going to pass out and so forth. It's this low oxygen state in the brain just before you lose consciousness is very pleasurable, very, very pleasurable state. But anyway, I've had that because I have low blood pressure. I've had this experience of almost losing consciousness numerous times, actually having lost consciousness a few times, and it's always been just very pleasant. But the main thing was it made me realize that death really is the absence of consciousness, and the absence of consciousness is not sitting or floating in darkness forever and ever and ever, the way I had imagined death to be previously. I had imagined death as I would still be conscious, but floating in nothingness forever and ever. And of course, when you think about it, that doesn't make any sense at all. If death really is the absence of consciousness, then it's the absence of light or dark. It's neither light nor dark. And in the absence of time, it doesn't go on any length of time, and we don't even notice the fact that our consciousness is not there anymore. Our consciousness would have to be there for us to notice it not being there. So that's why the ancient philosopher Epicurus, who basically had the same concept of death, he said, why should I worry about death? Why should I even think about death? If I'm here, that means I'm conscious. And I'm not dead. So death is not here. If I'm here, death is not here. But if death is here, that means I'm no longer conscious. And if I'm no longer conscious, I'm not here. So death and I are never going to coexist. I am never going to be dead. Neither are you. None of us is ever going to be dead. At the moment of death, we simply cease to exist. Our consciousness, which is us, our consciousness ceases to exist. And we don't notice anything at that point. And we don't remember that we were conscious a moment ago. As soon as consciousness is gone, so is memory. So we are not sitting there comparing the fact that I was conscious a moment ago with the fact that I no longer exist at all. Everything that we ever experienced when we were conscious vanishes when our brain finally shuts down and our consciousness dissolves for the last time. There is no experience at that point, and it doesn't last for any time. And the interesting thing is that we've been through this thousands of times in our life, 1,000 times a year. So I'm 76. I've been through what it's like to be dead 76,000 times in my life. And I don't remember them. I don't remember a single one of those times, because you can't remember anything if your consciousness isn't there, because you're not having any experience to be remembered. One of the interesting times that I've been aware of having gone into dreamless sleep and then come back out of it, and the fact that there has been no felt time, there has been no subjectively felt time passing during the time that I've been without consciousness, is watching TV with my wife. We get in bed and we have pillows up behind us so we can recline comfortably while we're watching the TV that's down at the other end of the room. And, some nights, I'm feeling sleepy, so my eyes are tired. I've been doing some reading all day long or something else. And so I'm just going to rest my eyes. So I close my eyes just to listen to the story, okay? And maybe it's an hour-long program, and it's just begun. It's about 10 minutes into the program, and I think, I'm just going to close my eyes and just listen to it for a little while. I won't go to sleep, but I'll just listen to it, And so I do that. I'm listening to the dialogue there, and then all of a sudden I hear the music that is the end music for the program, the end title music, and the program's over. But it was just a second ago, just a moment ago, that I was listening to the dialogue at the very beginning of the program. So 45 minutes at least has gone by, and my consciousness has been absent. I have been effectively dead for 45 minutes. And then the end title music woke me back up and resurrected me. And I have no memory at all of those 45 minutes, and they didn't take any time at all. There was no time there. The first time I ever experienced that, really, the absence of time during unconsciousness, was when I was about 6 years old, and I had my tonsils out. And I remember, being told about the operation by my parents, being at the hospital, and this big mask came over my face to put anesthetic gas, for me to breathe anesthetic gas so I would go under. I remember the mask coming over like that, and then I remember waking up, and I was in bed in the hospital room, and I had the worst sore throat of my life. And that operation was over. I don't know how long it took him to do it. I'm sure it didn't take more than, half an hour, or whatever. I don't know how long I was out, but there was no time there at all. I got the anesthetic, and then shazam, I was awake again. And I've had the same experience with other minor surgery later on in my life. And it's always the same, you know. One moment you're waiting for the operation to take place, and you're talking with the anesthetic. Now they give you a little injection, you know, you're talking briefly with the anesthetic, and the next thing you know, you're sitting in bed and the whole thing's over. And it just flowed like this. And so what that means is that if for some reason, and I'm just putting this out as a hypothesis, not saying it actually happens, but if it did happen, it's a thought experiment. If we live here as a human being on this planet Earth and we die, and our consciousness evaporates, and then, you know, the universe implodes or explodes a few times, you know, we get sucked into a black hole and then spit out again, you know, and eventually there's another universe, another planet that's capable of sustaining life on it, you know, and there's an organism there that starts having a consciousness. It's a little embryo organism that then, you know, is born and sees the world and everything. And supposing that we somehow were participating in that consciousness, all that time in between our death as a human being, and maybe 1,000 billion years went by, maybe a huge amount of time went by, before we found ourselves in this consciousness of another organism on another planet in another universe. Those two consciousnesses would have flowed right into one another. That 1,000 billion years would not have been there, because all periods without consciousness are exactly the same length of time, which is zero length of time. A nanosecond. I don't even know what a nanosecond is, but it's apparently the tiniest little bit of a second that's possible. A nanosecond is infinitely longer. It's 1 billion times longer than any period of time when we don't have consciousness. All periods of the absence of consciousness have no duration of time whatsoever, no duration in time at all, no felt experience of time passing whatsoever. And so we've all died thousands of times in our life during dreamless sleep at night. We don't notice it. We never remember it, but it's happened to us nonetheless. And every one of those periods of dreamless sleep, when our consciousness is temporarily absent, that is exactly like what being dead will be like. Except that we probably won't come back into another consciousness, but it won't matter because it still will not have any duration in time. We still won't even be able to realize that we're not there. It won't bother us in the slightest. We'd have to have an emotional brain and consciousness in order to be bothered by the fact that we're not there. But when you don't even notice you're not there, and that not noticing that you're not there lasts no length of time, and we've all been through it thousands of times in our life, and that is what's going to happen to all of us, no matter what we believe, no matter what we wish would happen, no matter how we live our lives, whether we're good, bad, or indifferent. When our life is over, we just have one more period of unnoticeable, dreamless sleep, like we've been through thousands of times before. That's all it is. Now, that's very important for pleasurology, because if we want to enjoy our lives, it's important that we not be afraid of death. And death is the one thing that makes people really anxious. And so that's why people have religion, so that they can believe that death is not real. So they can believe that their consciousness will go on existing without their brain and without their body, forever, which is just an imaginary pipe dream. And There's nothing, I mean, it makes them happy. It makes them happy to believe that. So there's no point trying to convince them that it's not true, because they are going to convince themselves it is true because they want to believe it. All right? They just want to believe it. And if you want to believe that, you're going to believe that. And that's fine. But for those of us, who look at the scientific reality of things and say, well, consciousness produces the brain, or rather, the brain produces consciousness. And when the brain stops producing consciousness, consciousness is not going to be floating around anywhere. It's just not going to be there. But we don't have to be frightened or depressed or pessimistic about that. What that does is it says, okay, there's no point worrying about death. Worrying about death is not going to change the experience of death in any way at all, because there is no experience of death. It's impossible for us to actually be dead and experience being dead. That's impossible. So there is no experience of death, and nothing can change that. Nothing can make death into any kind of experience whatsoever. And this is why Spinoza, the philosopher, said, the wise man thinks about death less than he thinks about anything else. The wise man thinks about anything else more than he thinks about death. Now, I kind of disagree with him. I think it's important for us to think about death. But we shouldn't think about death sloppily or inaccurately, or imagining that death is actually different from what it is. What we have to do is think about death precisely. That death is precisely no experience for precisely no time, and is completely unnoticeable to us. And therefore, we are never going to have any experience of being dead whatsoever. And there's nothing anyone can do to change that, one way or the other. And knowing that, then that changes how we live our lives. We're certainly not going to waste our time living our life trying to please an imaginary being that we, imagine can give us life forever, because that's just magical thinking. That's completely imaginary thinking. And we're just wasting our time to try and live our lives to please an imaginary being in order to get an imaginary afterlife. That's a whole lot of needless effort. And the problem with that is that people who believe all this imaginary stuff oftentimes think that they have a duty to force other people to share their delusion. A delusion is believing that the imaginary is real and not recognizing, no, it's just imaginary. We can't know anything about, imaginary, invisible, non-physical beings whatsoever. We can make up whatever we want. We can make up whatever stories we want about them. But none of those stories can ever be validated. None of those stories can ever be proven true. And so, but the problem is, people who believe these stories because they're so old, because they're thousands of years old, and if something is imaginary, if it's thousands of years old, it's more likely to be true than if it's something imaginary that we've just imagined this minute. No, it isn't. Something that's completely imaginary about non-physical imaginary beings or an imaginary state of life after death, whether we've imagined it just right now or whether it was imagined by people who lived thousands of years ago, who were, as ignorant as could be, didn't know their head from a hole in the ground. Imagination stays imagination. It doesn't gradually turn into the truth over time just because it's old and a lot of people have been believing it. It doesn't matter how many people believe something that's imaginary. That doesn't make it true. You cannot turn an imaginary belief into the truth just because you can get a lot of people to believe it with you. What you can do is persuade other people to share your delusion. The more people who all get together and say, okay, we're all going to believe this delusion, we're all going to believe this imaginary idea, then they feel more confident. Well, if you believe it and you believe it, if everybody believes it, well, it must be true because we all believe it. And again, that's a fallacy. Something that's imaginary never becomes true, even if everyone in the world believes it. It does not become true. It remains imaginary forever. The only way something imaginary can become true is if we can observe whatever the imagination is about and actually see that it's real by observing it with our senses or with our scientific instruments so that we know it's actually there. If we can't do that, if we cannot empirically observe that something is there because we can see it, touch it, hear it, feel it, smell it, or measure it with some scientific instrument, if we can't observe it in any way whatsoever, then it remains nothing but the figment of a human imagination. And it doesn't matter how many human imaginations want to believe that this imaginary thing is true, that will never transform something imaginary into something true. And yet, people will believe imaginary stuff because they want to, because they're so scared of death. And that's why I think it's really important to talk about death and to recognize that death is something that we don't have to worry about, something that's inevitable for all of us, and it's just the way things are. And we shouldn't quit trying to force other people to share our delusions about death. So, we pleasurologists, if we have our own religion of pleasurology, what's going to bind us together into a community of pleasurologists, the first church of pleasurology, okay? What's going to bind us into a community is not imaginary ideas about what happens to us when we're dead and we're no longer conscious. What happens to us after our consciousness has dissolved. That's not what's going to bind us together. What's going to bind us together is creating genuine happiness for each other with physical nurturing affection, with social interaction, with massages, with sandwich hugs, and making ourselves feel good with body-mind pleasurology and super euphoric sex. All these things, that's what's going to bind us together, is our shared pleasure in life. And we're not going to persecute anybody that doesn't want to join pleasurology, that doesn't want to be a pleasurologist, okay? Non-pleasurologists, if they don't want to be a pleasurologist, that's too bad for them. Okay, fine. But we're certainly not going to try and force them to enjoy life if they don't want to. That's everybody's individual decision, how they feel like they want to enjoy life the most. And so we're not going to persecute non-pleasurologists. But on the other hand, we're not going to let anti-pleasurologists persecute us and force us to submit to their anti-pleasurology attitudes. Their anti-pleasurology attitudes are completely irrational, and we will not let them impose that on us. Okay, that's plenty for today. Thank you very much for listening. I'll talk to you again next time.